The dust of the plains, a choking shroud the color of forgotten sorrows, had clung to Eliza Mayhew for 3 relentless weeks, settling into the very weave of her coarse woolen dress, a constant, gritty reminder of the life she'd left and the terrifying unknown she rode towards. Each jarring lurch of the stagecoach was a punctuation mark in a sentence of despair, the vast, unforgiving sky above a boundless canvas of her own insignificance. She clutched the worn carpet bag on her lap, its meager contents representing the entirety of her worldly hope, a fragile vessel on a turbulent sea. The town of redemption, when it finally materialized from the heat haze, offered no immediate solace, its name a bitter irony against the backdrop of raw timber buildings huddled against the endless expanse like wary settlers braced for an ambush. Whispers, insidious as the dust, had preceded her, slithering through the cracks of the boardwalks, painting her as an object of scorn before she'd even set foot on redemption soil. Jedediah Thorne, a man whose tailored coat and smug demeanor seemed out of place yet entirely in command of this rough-hewn settlement, had seen to that. His laughter, rich and oily, had been the soundtrack to her rumored arrival, a cruel overture to a spectacle of his own devising. Silas Blackwood, the reclusive rancher, the man whose advertised need for a wife Eliza had answered with a heart full of trepidation and a desperate prayer, was Thorne's pawn in this heartless game. Thorne, it was said, bore Blackwood an old grudge, and this mail-order bride, this woman spoken of in snide, dehumanizing terms regarding her supposed ungainliness, was to be the punchline. As Eliza descended, her limbs stiff, her spirit bruised, a wave of palpable disdain washed over her from the small crowd gathered. Faces, hard and weathered, turned towards her, some curious, some openly contemptuous, their eyes raking over her form, confirming the cruel caricatures Thorne had so gleefully circulated. A flush of shame, hot and fierce, crept up her neck, her gaze falling to the splintered planks beneath her worn boots. Thorne, standing prominent, a silver-topped cane glinting in the harsh sunlight, savored the moment, a thin smile playing on his lips. And then she saw him, Silas Blackwood, standing apart from the others, a figure etched in shadow and silence. He was taller than she'd imagined, broad-shouldered, his face unreadable beneath the brim of a stained hat, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond her, or perhaps, through her. The preacher, a man whose breath reeked of stale whiskey even from several feet away, mumbled through a perfunctory ceremony, his words slurring into the charged atmosphere. Thorne's occasional chuckle punctuated the farce. Eliza felt a hollowness expand within her chest, a cavern where hope had once flickered. This was it, then. The culmination of her desperate gamble. She was a public humiliation, a walking jest. As the preacher declared them man and wife, a smattering of snickers rippled through the onlookers. In that moment of profound degradation, as the world seemed to shrink to the point of a pinprick of agony, Silas Blackwood moved. He leaned towards her, his presence unexpectedly solid, a shield against the barbs of the crowd, and his voice, low and rough, grazed her ear, a breath against the storm. "You're all I've ever wanted." The words, so utterly incongruous with the scene, with the weight of her shame, hung in the air, a suspended chord of disbelief. Eliza's head snapped up, her eyes, wide with shock and confusion, meeting his for the first time. There was no mockery in their depths, no amusement, only an intensity that pierced through her despair, a flicker of something she couldn't name, something that defied the crushing reality of the moment. It was a lifeline thrown into an abyss, too astonishing to grasp, too fragile to trust, yet undeniably there. The wind picked up, swirling the ever-present dust around them, as if trying to obscure that impossible whisper, but it had already lodged itself in Eliza's heart, a seed of bewilderment in the barren soil of her desolation. The journey to Silas Blackwood's ranch was a silent passage across a land that seemed to stretch into eternity, the sky a vast, indifferent canvas arching over them. The wagon wheels cut ruts into the parched earth, a monotonous rhythm that matched the somber beat of Eliza's thoughts. Silas handled the reins with an economy of movement, his profile stern against the horizon, offering no words to fill the chasm of unspoken things between them. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was a testament to solitude. A small, sturdy cabin stood weathered and unadorned, accompanied by a barn and a few corrals, all of it dwarfed by the immense, rolling plains that surrounded them like a restless sea. Near the cabin, under the solitary watch of a gnarled cottonwood, Eliza's eyes caught a small, weathered wooden marker, its inscription long faded by sun and storm, a silent sentinel to a sorrow that permeated the very air of the place. This, she sensed, was the heart of Silas's isolation, the unspoken grief that clung to him like the dust of the trail. Inside, the cabin was sparse, functional, bearing the hallmarks of a life lived without the softening touch of a woman's hand, yet clean in a stark, masculine way. It was a space that spoke of loss, of a life pared down to its barest essentials. Eliza, still reeling from the shock of his whispered words at the crude ceremony, felt a profound sense of dislocation. She was a stranger in a strange land, yoked to a man who was himself an enigma, his pronouncement a riddle she could not solve. Yet, within her, a stubborn ember of resilience began to glow. She had not endured the shame of her past, the hardship of her journey, only to crumble now. With a quiet determination that had been her shield for years, Eliza began to impose a gentle order on the cabin. She swept the rough-hewn floor, aired out the single room, and, finding a meager supply of flour and dried beans, prepared a simple meal. Silas watched her, his gaze mostly unreadable, yet there was a stillness in his observation that was not unkind. He moved with a quiet capability, tending to the livestock, mending a loose hinge on the cabin door, his actions practical, grounded. He ate the food she prepared without comment, but his eyes, when they briefly met hers, held a flicker of something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps just acknowledgement. Days bled into a routine of shared silence and unspoken understanding. Eliza learned the rhythm of the ranch, the language of Silas's movements. She discovered his competence, the way his calloused hands were surprisingly gentle with a newborn calf, the set of his jaw when he scanned the horizon for rain clouds that rarely came. She, in turn, worked tirelessly, mending his worn shirts, tending a small patch of earth near the cabin where she hoped to coax some hardy vegetables to life, her presence a quiet counterpoint to his brooding solitude. One afternoon, a wagon approached, a welcome intrusion in the vast emptiness. It was Martha, a widow from a homestead several miles distant, her face a roadmap of kindness etched by sun and wisdom. She greeted Eliza with an open smile, her eyes, clear and perceptive, taking in the young woman with a warmth that Eliza had not felt in what seemed like a lifetime. Martha brought a small pot of herbs and a loaf of fresh bread, her presence filling the cabin with a comforting normalcy. She spoke easily of the weather, of her own small triumphs and struggles, and as she talked, she subtly wove in threads of Silas's past, of the wife and child he had lost to a fever years ago, of the good man he was beneath the layers of his grief. "He's a man of deep waters, child," Martha said, her hand resting on Eliza's for a moment. "Still waters run deep, but they also reflect the sky, if you give them a chance." Martha's visit was a balm to Eliza's spirit. She saw Eliza, not as the subject of Thorne's cruel joke, but as a woman of substance, and her acceptance was a quiet affirmation. When Martha left, Eliza felt a renewed sense of purpose. She looked at Silas, truly looked at him, and saw not just the stoic rancher, but the wounded protector, a man whose whispered words, she began to believe, might not have been a fluke of madness or pity, but a glimpse into a heart capable of profound feeling. That evening, as Eliza tended to a wilting wildflower she had transplanted near the cabin door, coaxing life into its fragile stem, she felt Silas's eyes on her. The silence between them was still vast, but it no longer felt empty, it felt expectant, like the air before a gentle rain. The slow, unhurried turning of the seasons began to mirror the gradual unfolding of the connection between Eliza and Silas. Autumn painted the plains in hues of ochre and russet, the air crisping with the promise of colder days. Shared meals around the rough-hewn table, once eaten in stiff silence, now occasionally held the murmur of necessary conversation, a question about the mending of a fence, an observation about the migrating geese overhead. Eliza found herself anticipating Silas's quiet presence, the way his large hands moved with surprising deftness as he repaired a harness, the rare, almost imperceptible softening around his eyes when she managed to coax a small, brave bloom from her struggling garden patch. He, in turn, began to seek her out, not with words, but with presence, often working on some task near the cabin while she went about her chores. He taught her to identify the calls of different prairie birds, to read the signs of changing weather in the clouds, his voice, when he spoke of the land, holding a rough poetry. One evening, a storm blew in with sudden ferocity, the wind howling like a banshee, rain lashing against the cabin. A loose shutter banged relentlessly. Before Eliza could voice her concern, Silas was outside, battling the elements to secure it, his silhouette a defiant figure against the tumultuous sky. When he returned, soaked and shivering, Eliza wordlessly took his wet coat and handed him a steaming mug of coffee she had kept warm by the fire. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that sent an unexpected warmth through her. He looked at her then, a long, searching look that held a dawning awareness, a recognition of the quiet strength she possessed. His own grief, the constant companion of so many years, seemed to loosen its grip, replaced by a tentative stirring of life, a feeling he had thought long dead. Jedediah Thorne, however, was not a man to let a perceived slight go unpunished. His cruel joke had not yielded the satisfying destruction of Silas Blackwood he had envisioned. Instead, whispers were now reaching redemption of a different sort, of the quiet dignity of Blackwood's wife, of a subtle change in the reclusive rancher himself. This infuriated Thorne. His pettiness festered, seeking new outlets. When Eliza ventured into redemption for supplies, a journey she undertook with a knot of anxiety in her stomach, Thorne made a point of crossing her path. He tipped his hat with exaggerated politeness, his eyes cold and mocking. "Mrs. Blackwood," he drawled, his voice carrying to the few townsfolk within earshot, "redemption still marvels at your resilience. And your husband's peculiar tastes." Eliza met his gaze, her heart pounding, but her voice, when she replied, was steady. "My husband has excellent taste in what truly matters, Mr. Thorne." Something you clearly wouldn't understand. Her quiet defiance, the lack of fear in her eyes, seemed to momentarily surprise him. He scowled, his veneer of civility cracking, before stalking away. The encounter, though unsettling, solidified something within Eliza. She would not be cowed. The town remained a mixture of wary curiosity and lingering judgment. Some, like the storekeeper who offered her a small, sympathetic smile, were beginning to see past Thorne's narrative. Others still looked at her with suspicion, their minds poisoned by Thorne's earlier slanders. But Eliza walked with her head held high, her purpose clear. She was building a life, a fragile, precious thing, alongside a man who, against all odds, seemed to value her. Martha, during another welcome visit, brought with her a small, hand-stitched quilt, a gift of friendship. As Eliza admired the intricate pattern, Martha watched Silas, who was mending a bridle nearby, his attention seemingly on his task, yet Eliza sensed he was listening. "A good marriage is like a quilt, child," Martha said softly. "Made of different pieces, some plain, some fancy, all stitched together with patience and strong thread. It keeps you warm when the world turns cold later." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes, Eliza found Silas watching her as she folded the quilt. His expression was uncharacterable, a mixture of a deep sorrow she was beginning to understand and a new, tentative light. He said nothing, but his silence was no longer a wall, it was an invitation, a space where understanding could slowly, carefully, take root and grow. The quiet rhythm of their days was building something stronger than either of them had anticipated, a bond forged in shared solitude and mutual respect, a silent promise whispered on the prairie wind. The fragile peace of their burgeoning life was shattered by the cry of fire. It was a dry summer, the prairie grasses tinder-ready, and a spark, perhaps from a careless traveler or a strike of lightning, had ignited a blaze that was now racing across the plains, fanned by a relentless wind, heading directly towards their ranch and several others in its path. Panic, sharp and cold, gripped Eliza, but Silas was a pillar of grim resolve. His eyes, scanning the rapidly approaching wall of smoke and orange flame, were hard, but his movements were swift and purposeful. "Eliza, to the creek," he yelled over the roar of the wind and the crackling inferno. "Soak blankets, clothes, anything you can. We have to wet down the cabin and the barn." There was no time for fear, only for action. Eliza, her heart hammering against her ribs, raced towards the shallow creek that bordered their property, her skirts hitched high. The water was cool, a stark contrast to the scorching air. She worked with frantic energy, soaking the heavy wool blankets Martha had given them, her hands raw, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Silas was already on the roof of the cabin, dousing it with buckets of water drawn from their well, his face streaked with soot, his expression intense. The heat was becoming unbearable, the smoke acrid and choking. Sparks rained down around them like malevolent fireflies. They worked side by side, a desperate, silent team, the crackle of the flames a monstrous heartbeat counting down their chances. Eliza saw it then, the raw, protective instinct in Silas, not just for his property, but for her. He'd push her back when a gust of wind sent embers too close, his arm a brief, strong barrier. In that crucible of danger, all pretense was burned away. They were two souls fighting for survival, for the small patch of existence they had begun to carve out together. As the fire licked at the edges of their cleared land, a new threat emerged. Jedediah Thorne, on horseback, appeared through the smoky haze, not to help, but to gloat, or perhaps to ensure the destruction was complete. He reined in his horse at a safe distance, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched their desperate efforts. "Looks like your luck has run out, Blackwood," Thorne shouted, his voice laced with malice. "Perhaps the prairie itself finds your union distasteful." Silas, his face a mask of fury and determination, ignored him, continuing to battle the encroaching flames. But Thorne, emboldened, rode closer. "Maybe you should have listened to reason, Blackwood. Some things, and some people," he said, his gaze flicking contemptuously towards Eliza, "are just not meant to thrive." It was then that Eliza, her face smudged with soot, her dress singed, her spirit ablaze with a righteous anger, stepped forward. "This is our home, Mr. Thorne," she cried, her voice surprisingly strong above the roar. "And we will fight for it. Something you, with all your stolen comfort, will never understand." Thorne, taken aback by her ferocity, sneered. "Brave words from—" But before he could finish his insult, Silas was there, moving with a speed that belied his size. He grabbed the bridle of Thorne's horse, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "Get off my land, Thorne," Silas growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Your presence here is a blight worse than any fire." For the first time, Eliza saw a flicker of fear in Thorne's eyes. He tried to pull his horse away, but Silas's grip was like iron. Just then, a shout came from the distance. Other ranchers, their own properties threatened or already saved, were riding towards them, alerted by the smoke, coming to offer aid. The sight of approaching help, and Silas's unwavering defiance, seemed to deflate Thorne. He spat on the ground. "You haven't seen the last of me." Blackwood, with a vicious tug on the reins, he wheeled his horse and galloped away, a coward retreating from a battle he had hoped to enjoy from the sidelines. The arrival of their neighbors marked a turning point. With more hands, they managed to beat back the flames, creating fire breaks, dousing the last of the embers that threatened the cabin and barn. As the immediate danger passed, leaving behind a scarred, blackened landscape, Eliza and Silas stood side by side, exhausted, smoke-stained, but unbroken. In the smoky twilight, surrounded by the devastation, Silas turned to Eliza. His usual reserve was gone, his face raw with emotion. "Eliza," he began, his voice hoarse, "when I lost Mary and little Samuel, I thought my life was over. The world became grey. I just existed." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound, aching sincerity. "That day, in town, when I saw you, standing there, so alone, facing all that scorn, I saw a strength in you, a spirit they couldn't break. It reminded me of what I'd lost, but also, what could still be. My words then, they weren't a kindness, Eliza. They were the truest thing I'd felt in years." For single tear traced a path through the soot on Eliza's cheek. The community, those who had come to help, watched them, no longer with suspicion, but with a newfound respect. They had seen Eliza's courage, Silas's fierce protection, and Thorne's villainy laid bare. The fire had burned away more than just grass, it had incinerated old prejudices and forged new bonds of admiration. The dawn that followed the fire broke over a landscape irrevocably altered, yet imbued with a stark, poignant beauty. The air, though still tinged with the scent of smoke, felt cleaner, purged. Eliza and Silas moved through the charred remains of their pastureland, a shared ache in their muscles, a deeper, quieter understanding settling between them. The cabin and barn stood, smoke-stained but intact, testaments to their desperate, united efforts. The small patch of garden Eliza had nurtured was mostly ash, but as she sifted through the blackened soil, she found a single, stubborn wildflower, its stem bent but its petals still defiantly colorful, a tiny flag of hope in the desolation. Silas came to stand beside her, his large hand gently covering hers as she touched the resilient bloom. "Life finds a way," he said softly, his gaze meeting hers, filled with a warmth that enveloped her more completely than the morning sun. The cruel joke that had brought them together had been consumed by the flames of adversity, and from its ashes, something genuine and powerful had emerged. Their marriage, born of desperation and deceit, had been reforged in the crucible of shared struggle, tempered by courage, and was now sealed by an unspoken, undeniable love. The community, having witnessed their bravery and Thorn's cowardice, no longer saw Eliza as an object of ridicule or Silas as merely a grieving recluse. They saw a strong woman and a resolute man, a couple who had faced down disaster and the malice of a petty tyrant, and had emerged stronger. Offers of help to rebuild fences and replant came readily. Martha arrived with food and a quiet pride in her eyes, her earlier words about a quilt made of different pieces echoing with new meaning. Thorn, his reputation in tatters, found redemption decidedly less welcoming. His influence waned, his power diminished by the clear display of his craven nature. He eventually left town, a bitter man whose cruelty had ultimately backfired, leaving him more isolated than Silas had ever been. Weeks turned into months. The land began to heal, new green shoots pushing through the blackened earth. Eliza and Silas worked together, rebuilding, replanting, their silences now comfortable, their conversations easy, punctuated by shared laughter, a sound once foreign to the Stark cabin, now a frequent, welcome guest. The ranch was no longer a place of sorrow and isolation, but a home filled with the quiet industry of shared purpose and the gentle glow of affection. Eliza, no longer the shamed outcast, moved with a newfound confidence. She had found her place, not by conforming to societal expectations, but by embracing her own strength and worth, and by finding a man who saw her, truly saw her, for who she was. Her quiet dignity had blossomed into a radiant self-assurance. Silas, drawn from the shadows of his past, was a man transformed. The grief for his lost family would always be a part of him, a tender scar, but it no longer defined him. Eliza had brought light back into his world, given him a new reason to live, to love, to protect. His stoicism had softened, revealing the deep well of tenderness within. One evening, as the sun cast long shadows across the recovering plains, they stood on the porch of their cabin, watching the colors bleed across the sky. Eliza leaned her head against Silas's shoulder, a comfortable, familiar gesture. He wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "You know," Eliza said softly, "that day in town, when you whispered those words. I thought I was dreaming, or that you were mad." Silas chuckled, a low, warm sound. "Perhaps a little of both." Mad to hope, after all that time he turned her to face him, his eyes, so often guarded in the past, now open and filled with an unwavering love. "But it was the sanest thing I'd ever done. You were, and you are, Eliza, everything I never dared to wish for again." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently tracing the curve of her cheekbones, his gaze unwavering. And Eliza knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she was home. Here, on this rugged land, beside this strong, good man, she had found not just a life, but a love that had redeemed them both, a love as resilient and as beautiful as a wildflower blooming in the ashes. The vast frontier, once a symbol of her desolation, now stretched before them, a landscape of boundless promise, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to find hope and build anew, even in the harshest of terrains.